Shahid Naeem. I'm a professor of ecology at Columbia University in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology. I'm also the director of the Earth Institute for Environmental Sustainability. When we think about our planet, I think the most unique feature we think about are all the species that you can find. There are millions and millions of them. Some of them we know are very popular: lions, tigers, bears, and so forth. But there are actually about 8.7 million species, maybe more. At least current estimates predict that. So when we say, what is biodiversity, most people think it's just those millions of species. But actually, it's much more complicated than that. Here, for example, imagine you had a garden with 100 species of roses in it. But your neighbor had 3 species. One was a species of rose, but also had an orchid and a sunflower. Actually, most biologists would consider that your neighbor has a much more diverse garden than you, which contains mostly just roses. So the number of species isn't really the issue. Here's another example. If you think about the fact that ecosystems do important work, like recycling nutrients or producing oxygen, there are many species that contribute to that functioning. But if you had an ecosystem which was missing some of those key species, well, that's not very diverse either, because it's missing what we would call functional diversity. So I just talked about taxonomic diversity and functional diversity, but there's also genetic diversity, genomic diversity, proteomic diversity, landscape diversity. It goes on and on and on. So biodiversity is all that stuff wrapped into one. And it's a really complicated term, but it's also an important one. And I think with the technology we have today, we're making great inroads into understanding what it means.
Many scientists argue that our planet is currently in the midst of its 6th mass extinction of plants and animals, meaning that nearly half of all species could disappear in the next few decades. There are many factors at play, including climate change, pollution, overharvesting, all of which contribute to the impoverishment of ecosystems and biodiversity loss. Joining me now to discuss this trend is Shahid Naeem, Director of Science at the Earth Institute Center for Sustainability at Columbia University. So tell me, first of all, mass extinction sounds incredibly scary, and I'm thinking it is.
It is. It's happened before, so I think when something's happened before, people tend to think, well, maybe it won't be so bad. We've gotten through 5 of them after all, right?
Right.
So won't we get through the 6th one? There's some truth to that. The problem is we're actually in the middle of this one, and we're also the cause of it.
And humans weren't around for all 5 of the previous ones, and certainly not 7 billion or 8 billion of us, right?
Right, and I think that that's part of the problem is that maybe if there were fewer numbers of people living on the planet, the environmental consequences of losing all this biological diversity wouldn't be so bad. But we're looking at 7.5, maybe up to 9 billion people in the next 50 years who could really suffer a lot of consequences from losing biodiversity.
Okay, so what are the billions of people that are on the planet doing today to hurry this mass extinction along?
So I think that much of what's happening is really something that isn't connected to biodiversity loss. There's a lot of effort to conserve species, a lot of effort to try to protect endangered habitats. And I think the focus tends to come from our idea that there's sort of a cultural or emotional attachment that we have to species. But what that creates is a sense is that if we have protected areas and parks or national forests, that'll do the trick because we can save all the species. Almost as if you felt you put them in an ark, and that's all you have to do. But then we forget that biodiversity actually consists of all the species that are parts that make our ecosystems work. So things like potable water, breathable air, the cycling of nutrients, the stable production of food, both on terrestrial and marine systems, all of that depends on all of these parts working together. So if there are 8.7 million parts that are making our Earth work, and we're about to lose half of them, that's of concern.
Okay, and you know, in biology class in middle school or something, you learn about the food chain and how when you take something out of the food chain, it could have ripple effects. But beyond this one singular chain, what you're describing is kind of a multivariate system with all of these millions of parts are existing, and you know, one goes down here and another goes down here. There are these different consequences that we haven't thought of.
Yeah, so when I teach this, one of the things I like to do, if I can, is to find an old computer and bring it into the class, pop the top off of it, and then I ask the students when I reach in with a pair of pliers to remove a part, what's going to happen? And many of them immediately think that the computer is going to crash, or maybe sparks will fly out like a science fiction movie. That doesn't usually happen. In fact, you can pull out a few parts and the computer seems to still be working. In that case, I think they have a sense that in the computer you have many, many parts that are all connected to one another, and they produce complex processes that we really depend on from our computer. The funny thing is, if you try to then sell them the computer, even though it's working and you've removed just a few parts, they won't buy it. They're convinced that it's not really a good computer anymore. But if I told them that the biosphere, which is this 3.5 billion-year-old, trillion-ton solar-powered machine, is losing half its parts, it doesn't seem to worry them as much as if you lost some parts from your computer.
Well, besides those students, there are still people who are out there that say, it's not human action. What evidence do we have that it's what we're doing that's actually causing this extinction versus different natural cycles?
That's a difficult one to tackle, not so much that humans aren't at fault, but quantifying what's happening. So the big problem is that we estimate there's about 8.7 million species, but that's an estimate. And in fact, we probably only know about 2 or 3% of all the species that are out there. So then if we turn around and say, well, we're losing all these species, just after we said we don't actually know what's out there, then people say, what? How can you say those two things at one time? But we actually have very good ways of quantifying roughly how many species that are there. The same way astronomers can quantify how many stars are in the universe or how many planets are habitable in our galaxy or other galaxies. We have these very same methods, but people would prefer to have something more accurate than that.
How do you take the research that you're doing and turn that into a policy prescription or a suggestion for whether it's a government or a corporation that's working in different parts of the world that might have ecological concerns or consequences?
Well, there are lots of different ways of doing that. You can start right at home, encouraging people to, say, diversify the number of species they have in their garden, or maybe have a garden rather than a lawn. You can encourage people to consider buying food from an organic farm, which is usually much more diverse than an industrial farm. But then you can scale up and you can ask whether or not the city could invest more in, say, like in New York City, the Million Tree Planting campaign. And then you can scale it up to the global level. We have the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, which is hoping to achieve 20 different targets to conserve biodiversity by the year 2020. So it's 20 by 2020. There's a lot of numerical alliteration there. So I think at almost every level, from your home to your city to your nation to the world. What's interesting is that the Convention on Biological Diversity, every nation except the United States, Andorra, and the Vatican has signed that. That kind of global agreement that we really should preserve biodiversity shows that our research has actually had an impact and the world is listening.
All right, Shahid Naeem from the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Paper or plastic? It's a question we've grown accustomed to, and for many people the answer is automatic. But how do we know we're making the right ecological choices? Sustainability strategist Leyla Acaroglu has been working to answer this question. She joins reporter Andrea Vasquez to bust a few common eco-myths.
Environmental folklore, you say it's based mostly on our experiences, on hearsay, not always on science. What's going on?
Well, to start with, it's only been in the last few decades that we've actually really started to understand and analyze how our choices in the economy are having impacts on the planet. So it's really quite a new science to know if we make packaging from plastic and it ends up in the natural environment, what's going to happen. So this means that a lot of the information that's available to us is quite new. And also humans really like fuzzy feelings. And so I like to think of environmental folklore as that little voice in your head that says, pick the paper bag, it's so much better. But what we've started to discover with this new scientific analysis technique, new as in the last 20 years, life cycle assessment, it's really started to show us how activities in the economy aren't actually playing out the way we think. So how do you make a paper bag? Well, you have to go and cut down trees and you have to obviously process them. And then the same with plastic, you have to extract materials. Now they both have impacts, we know that, but that's in the production stage. A lot of our decisions about environmental impacts are based on our assumptions around the end of life. So what happens when we no longer want them? And we see plastic bags strewn on the street and we think a paper bag is better because it would just biodegrade, right?
Right.
Unfortunately, that's not what happens. Because when you take these two products and you look at their entire life, most of them end up in a landfill. And a landfill is what's called an anaerobic environment. It basically means it's got no air. Now, in that environment, what actually happens is these little microorganisms break down cellulose material. So anything that's made from an organic material, so your food waste.
Anything from the earth.
Exactly,
Okay.
yeah. So it starts to break it down like little guys munching away. Kind of like if you left a piece of fruit in a plastic bag for a few days, opened it up, doesn't smell so good.
Right, you get that gas release
That's
when you
right.
open it up.
And that gas is methane. And methane is a byproduct of this environment. Now the thing about this is that it's a 25 times more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So if you have this landfill environment, the paper bag is actually contributing to this negative environmental impact. But the critical issue with the bags has to do with the weight of them. Up to 10 times more material is used in order to create a paper bag with the same functionality as a plastic bag. So when you look at the whole life and you look at one bag versus another, the paper bag has a bigger impact because you need more material to achieve the function.
So there's a volume issue here that we're not considering. What are the other questions that we're just not thinking to ask in our well-intended efforts to be green and eco-friendly?
Well, the bag example basically isn't saying everyone rush out and use plastic bags. What it actually is telling us is that our predisposition to disposability is the issue, right? The fact that we do think that having disposable objects and that one alternative over another is going to make things better. The same applies to coffee cups, for example, you know. The average New Yorker uses 500 disposable coffee cups every year. Which is crazy, right?
Yes.
And the thing is that most of those paper cups are lined with a plastic film that make them unrecyclable. But unfortunately, what we're really looking at here is a crisis of consumption, because somehow collectively we've all said disposability is fine. I'm going to take that plastic bag and I'm going to use it once and then I'm going to throw it in the trash and I'm going to feel guilty about the few that I see out in the natural environment, but I'm not going to be really thinking about the whole picture. So to start with, we have to think about our choices day to day and how they impact the planet. And so a simple one would be obviously reusable bags, but the other thing is like having your coffee in the coffee shop with a nice ceramic cup. Very small micro changes can help influence the bigger system, because once customers start asking their local coffee shop for nicer reusable cups, they start responding to the customer demand.
What are some of the other myths in environmental folklore that you see as being very prevalent, and what's the data behind why we're so wrong about them?
I think that some of the biggest myths are that these terms like biodegradability, recyclability, renewable, they're all the like strong titans of the environmental movement, and they're amazing terms, but what they are material properties, right? They just describe what something can do.
Right.
So if you don't have the right system set up, so if you have something that's compostable, for example, and then you don't have a composting system, then you have that thing that I mentioned earlier about the landfill and the methane and the 25 times more potent greenhouse gases. So we have what's called a double negative. So really we need more efficient systems. So those material properties, the renewable and the biodegradable, they actually have that benefit rather than accidentally causing a bigger environmental impact.
So we need to be looking at the larger picture and also filtering some of the popular science and science tidbits that are giving us small pictures of things?
Sure. I mean, in any case, what we know is that simple and painless activities don't create big change. The easier it is, the less likely it's going to actually have the kind of change that we need. And so when it seems like an easy, quick fix solution, like all you have to do is change your light bulbs and suddenly we've solved climate change, I think that we can all smart enough to know that it's not as simple as that. Changing your light bulbs is a great first step, but if you then go and buy 2 televisions and leave them on half the night, you've actually created a bigger rebound effect, where your choices have validated a bigger impact. So, I mean, I don't want people to think that I'm saying everything's bad. I think what's really important is that we have a bit more of a curiosity about the way the world works, about systems and the choices we make, and that we don't fall into the trap of believing that some simple solution like a paper cup is going to somehow absolve all of the environmental impacts that come down to us using disposable items and us thinking that we're going to be able to solve the world's problems by just changing a light bulb or eating less meat.
Drinking our coffee out of a paper cup.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll try to look at the bigger picture then. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
When it comes to waste management, there's a lot of misinformation to sift through. To get to the truth, scientists perform life cycle analyses. These LCAs follow the entire chain of events from the manufacturing of a product to its disposal. Reporter Andrea Vasquez learned more from environmental consultant Jeffrey Morris via Google Hangout.
Jeff, thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, glad to be here. Thank you.
Can you tell us about these life cycle analyses and how they're performed and what you're really looking at?
So we have to look at all those stages of the life cycle of a product, and at each stage evaluate what the emissions are, the environmental impacts. So we look at greenhouse gas emissions, criteria, air pollutant emissions, toxics emissions, carcinogenic emissions, things that affect ecosystems, all that. And then we have to figure out a way to roll all that up into indicators of environmental impact. Carbon dioxide equivalence is the indicator for climate change impact. And we have those kinds of indicators for other environmental impacts like human respiratory disease or human toxicity or human carcinogenicity. Also ecosystems toxicity, eutrophication of waterways, acidification of the air, and trying to start to develop ways to have indicators of habitat impact. That's much harder, but people are working on that.
So after we finish with a product, we have a choice. Sometimes it's throwing something away that's going to end up either in a landfill or in some places in an incinerator. Can you explain some of the pros and cons of landfills and incinerators for our trash?
When you get to the bury or burn statement, it depends on what the composition of the material is that's going into the incinerator or the landfill. If you had all food waste, then it'd probably be better to burn it, because in the landfill, you would have to have a landfill gas capture efficiency that's very high, like up in the 80, 90%, to make the carbon emissions from the landfill lower than the carbon emissions from the incinerator, which releases all the carbon, but in the form CO2, which is less of an impact than methane. But food waste is really an exception. If you're talking about wood as the other end of the biogenic materials spectrum, then you only need to capture about 10% of the landfill gases for your carbon profile or footprint of the landfill to be better than of the incinerator. So in general, for the mixed garbage that you talk about putting into the landfill or the incinerator, even though you're producing electricity, that offset or that benefit is not great enough to offset the air emissions from the incinerator, because you're basically burning everything. And even though you have a good pollution control system, you still produce more emissions than if you landfilled that garbage with a decent landfill gas capture rate. So that's the kind of thing that you have to be aware of. And if you're going to build new facilities like a new landfill or a new cell at a landfill versus a new incinerator, then when you take into account the costs of those two and what you can do in terms of capturing the emissions, I think the landfill is probably better.
When we talk about these facilities, these landfills and incinerators that are designed to efficiently capture and produce energy from that trash, how many of the existing facilities that we have, landfills and incinerators, would meet those standards?
The smaller landfills, you might have an issue there in terms of whether they're capturing the landfill gases and whether they're lined underneath to capture the leachate. With the newer ones, they're required to have landfill gas capture systems and to be lined underneath so that the leachate doesn't percolate out. Incinerators are required to meet the clean air standards, so they should be doing a pretty good job.
So what's our best option?
Our best option is not to dispose of it, but to get it, to get the materials recycled, because you save from 20 to 90% of the energy when you recycle material versus making a product out of virgin materials. All the oil wells or the coal mines or the iron ore mines or the bauxite mines or the whatever you have to do to extract raw materials and refining them. You avoid that when you recycle. So you save from 5 to 95% of the energy that you would ordinarily expend if you made those products out of virgin content instead of recycled content. And environmentally, if you look at the climate impacts, you save from 50 to 90% of the greenhouse gas emissions if you make your products out of recycled materials. So these are valuable resources and shouldn't go to the landfill or the incinerator. They should be recycled. So, I mean, I think it's a devil's bargain to talk about, is it better to recycle or burn? It's not. It's better to do neither, and to set up your solid waste management system so that you can avoid disposing of things and instead reuse or recycle them or even reduce their use.
Right, and cut down on what's actually making it to that landfill or incinerator.
Correct.
Thank you for breaking it down for us, and thanks for being with us.
Oh, you're welcome. I hope that this has been informative for your viewers.